This week in Come Follow Me, it is the book of Judges. So I want to just explain briefly here a little bit about the purpose of this video and what it's intended to do and what it's not intended to do. Again, I've been using this video to help teachers, seminary and institute teachers, as well as teachers in church classes, Sunday school, young women's, young man, Relief Society, Elders Quorum, primary, and so forth, as well as families at home. I've been trying to give some ideas, a little bit of context, a little bit of content, and then give some ideas of how to teach it and apply it into our lives so it's helpful. Well, it's summertime. As you can see that the schedule this week, we are in the month of June. So most of my seminary teachers, they're taking the summer off, as they should. A few institute teachers are still be teaching as young adults meet year-round. But so most of this now for the summer, I'll just give a few short ideas often. I may not hit every week, but we'll do as many as we can and just give you a brief idea of something you can do maybe just once a week. Book of Judges is interesting. So let me show you a couple of things that might be helpful. First of all, let me show you there are 12 judges in the book of Judges. But we got to do a little bit of context with this to help this make sense. First of all, we don't know who wrote the book of Judges. We don't know when it was written. Most scholars think it was probably written about the time of Lehi, somewhere around that 600 BC. Again, give or take 100 years, but we really don't know. They've just tried to use some of the content in the book to see, okay, when was this written? They allude to some things that happened later, so we know a few of those things. Really, what was it written for? By this time, Joshua has died. He was a strong military and spiritual leader in the house of Israel. But after his departure, most of the tribes they kind of went tribal. Rather than having this large national sense of unity as a nation, they each did their own tribal thing. But you'll see, I'll show you a few verses here today of what the real problems were and how the Lord helped them solve those problems. And he did that with these 12 judges. Now, these 12 judges are not equal. They're not all righteous. They're not all wonderful, and they're not all the same length of time nor length of service. And many of them overlap, meaning one could be doing some great work up in Gilead while another one is down in Zebulun. And they could be contemporaries time-wise. But stories in here, they don't make that very clear. So if you were to calculate all the years by all the stories, it wouldn't match the time frame that we think that the reign of the judges took place. So let's take a look at a few things in here, and I think you'll start to see a picture, and I'll give a couple of ideas of how to teach this if you're in a classroom environment. Or for you moms trying to say, how do I help my family learn these 12 judges? I'll give you some thoughts and ideas. So open up to the book of Judges, please. And I'll just share a few things. A little bit of historical things. And remember, the children of Israel were commanded to go in and remove all the inhabitants of these people. They were given 400 years to repent and didn't. So the Lord says, no, we're removing them, just like he did with the children of the world during Noah's time period, right? It's the same similar situation here. Sometimes we think these were always righteous people going to fight a righteous war of self-defense. But when you read the book of Judges, you're going to get a different feeling. For example, in Judges chapter 1, verse 7, it's pretty graphic of what they did. Verse 8, I mean, they would literally set the towns on fire. They would annihilate everything in those cities. That was the command of the Lord. So sometimes our youth and people say, well, why would God command that? Well, a couple of things. Again, go back to the video when we talk about Noah and the ark. Why would God allow the death of all the inhabitants of the earth? I think we covered that there. But we also realize that these children of Israel at this time lived in a time period where terror was one of the tactics of war. And it appears that they used that tactic. They would do some horrible graphic things just to incite terror amongst people. Culturally, we live in the Western society of these last several hundred years where we assume that doesn't take place in war. And we're almost mortified when it does take place. But throughout the history of the world, that's always taken place in almost every society. So when we hear about it today, we're like, oh, that's just awful. That's the nature of mankind throughout the history of wars. So I'm not going to go any more into that, but I think we just need to be aware that if someone asks, were they doing these horrible things? Well, it appears that yes, that's just the time period of their day and the culture and who they did. I don't like it. That's not me. I'm not a warrior. I'm more of a preacher guy, right? But I do think we can historically put that in its proper contents. Now, I want you to go to verse 19, please. Judges chapter 1, verse 19. And the Lord was with Judah, and he drave out the inhabitants of the mountains, but could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley, because they had chariots of iron. I want to make sure something's clear here. It really wasn't that the Philistines who had iron chariots were more powerful. It's that they didn't have, Judah and the other tribes didn't have faith in the Lord, and they didn't keep the commandments that they were supposed to. We saw that the children of Israel can defeat the most powerful empire of the day, the Egyptians, right? You can't drive out the Philistines? Well, of course they could. Lack of faith, lack of obedience, lack of righteousness was the real cause here. But what you'll see is they were living in the mountains. In a modern terminology, the Israelites become almost like hillbillies. They live up in the hills, in these dungeons, in these caves, and in these hillsides, because they couldn't go down into the valleys and conquer the nations down there. So I think there's some cool things in there that you can study about. Do we have faith in the Lord that he will drive out our enemies before us? Our sins, our temptations, the wickedness before us. So let's, boy, there's so many in here. And what you'll see is in chapter 1 and 2 specifically, they list tribe after tribe after tribe of who they didn't remove. For example, verse 21, the children of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites. And you can go verse after verse after verse. Verse 27, neither did Manasseh drive out the inhabitants of Beth-shean. Verse 29, neither did Ephraim drive out the Canaanites that dwell in Gezer. I mean, over and over and over, they just list all of these tribes that, the tribes of Israel that didn't remove the inhabitants of all these lands that the Lord commanded them to do so. And so what's the result? Hundreds of years of conflict. So let me show you some verses. Go to chapter 2, please. Judges chapter 2. I'm going to read a few verses here because I really think chapter 2 is when you read as a family, as a class, a few verses here because it really states the story. Verse 1, and an angel of the Lord came up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I will make you to go up out of Egypt and have brought you unto the land which I swear unto your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. Verse 2, and ye shall make no league with the inhabitants of the land. Don't make a treaty. Don't make an alliance. Remember, they're supposed to go in and annihilate these people. Ye shall throw down their altars. Again, their false gods, their false traditions, their culture. Get rid of them. But ye have not obeyed my voice. Why have ye done this? Wherefore, this is verse 3 now. I also said, I will not drive them out from before you, but they shall be as thorns in your sides, and their gods shall be a snare unto you. It's almost as if, why didn't Lehi leave Laman and Lemuel? They could have had a wonderful promised land. But Laman and Lemuel were a constant, and the Lamanites eventually were a constant thorn in the sides of the Nephites, which kept them humble, which kept them relying on the Lord their God. In this case, these people become a snare and a thorn in the house of Israel because they didn't remove them, which over and over you're going to see a cycle here of being inflicted by these pesky neighbors, and then they have to return to the Lord to get help. And in this case, the Lord helps them with 12 judges. Now, we use the title judges. Don't think of the current system of judges. Think of it, these are more of military leaders. But what was set up was a system of judges that were to lead militarily and in righteousness to protect these people. King Benjamin tried to set up a system of judges in the Book of Mormon, which actually lasted quite a while, remember? Where the laws were set. King Benjamin set the laws. The judges were just to enforce the laws and to keep the people on the straight and narrow path. Well, likewise, Moses created the law. Joshua didn't have to write the law. He was just there to enforce the law. Here, these judges take the law and try to help the children of Israel stay on the straight and narrow path. These judges, these 12 judges, have military conquests. Again, some are just a couple of verses, some are a little bit longer. Let's take a look at just one or two more things. Judges chapter 2, verse 8, it states here that Joshua died being 110 years old. Remember, only he and Caleb lived in Egypt. Everyone else had died in the wilderness or were killed somehow, right? So verse 10, and also all that generation were gathered unto their fathers, and there arose another generation after them which knew not the Lord. Again, another generation is now passed. They're not familiar with what the Lord did in Egypt, except by the stories of their grandparents now. Verse 11, and the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and served Balaam. Now, two things. I want to make sure you understand who Balaam is. When you add the I-M or H-I-M in Hebrew, it's the plural. It's similar to the English S. For example, Eli means God. Elohim, El means God. Elohim, H-I-M, is just a pluralization. Baal, in this case, is the god it's a Phoenician god. It's their chief god. Adding the I am is the pluralization of this. So let me show you why this is important here. Verse 12, they forsook the Lord their God of their fathers, which brought them out of the land of Egypt. And what are they doing? God put the house of Israel in a situation where Egypt's down to the south, the Assyrians are up north, Israel's right in the middle. Everything's going to go through this land of Israel. He's giving the children of Israel a chance to spread the name of the Lord and do their missionary work by being in the center of the world. But instead, the outside influences taint the inhabitants of Israel, just like you and I. We're placed in the center of the world today. Are we going to influence the house of Israel and influence the world by spreading the gospel and sharing the message of the restored gospel of Jesus Christ? Or are we going to be tainted by the outside influences of the world because we're in the middle of it? It's really our choice. Now go to verse 13. And they forsook the Lord and served Baal and Ashtaroth. Now there's multiple ways of pronouncing those. When you listen to it, the Church in the Gospel Library app pronounced it Baal. That's okay. So who is Baal and who is this Ashtaroth? Baal is a Canaanite god. Ashtaroth is the Canaanite fertility goddess. This male and female deity that they served were their chief gods, god of fertility, which means they want the crops to grow, but it becomes more than just that. They would actually build groves and perform sexual rites in these groves to worship these gods and this god and this goddess. And to the point where the children of Israel would start to do this. You know, fertility is an important aspect of the land and of people. So, but it was offensive to the Lord because it's violating the most sacred laws of chastity that he'd created. So in the scriptures, you'll see from here on out all the time, these judges and later on kings will tear down the groves. You want to get rid of false gods, you had to tear down these groves because people were forming these pagan rituals that violated the law of chastity and so forth. So you'll see that in there. I want to make sure that's aware here. It's It's introduced here. But go to verse 16. Nevertheless, the Lord raises up judges which deliver them out of the hand of those that spoil them. And they would not hearken unto their judges, but they went a-whoring after other gods, and bowed themselves quickly, ... So let me just give you some ideas. Now you got a little background of what's going on with the children of Israel. Let me give you some ideas of how to teach this. There's 12 judges. Some of them are just a verse or two. You could read them and say, okay, what Christ-like attribute did this judge possess? Why is this judge listed in the book of Judges? What did he or she do that was righteous? Or you might read and say, this judge, what Christ-like attribute did this judge need to have or should have had that would have helped the children of Israel? Now, some of them are famous, and you should really make sure you cover those in your family during the week. Like Gideon, Deborah, two fabulous, wonderful judges that are very motivating, had some wonderful Christ-like attributes. Discuss those. You see some verses where it shows who they conquered, but in many cases you might have the whole chapter or longer. Then there's a judge at their 12th and final judge, Samson, right? Samson and Delilah. Delilah is not even his wife. Remember, his wife gets killed. Samson had such great potential, but missed the boat. So you can talk about what Christ-like attribute would have really blessed Samson, and then apply that to your life. So if you're teaching a class on Sunday, Sunday school's coming up this following Sunday, maybe you write the names of the 12 judges. You could divide up the class into 12 groups. Let's say there's 24 people, and put them in pairs and say, okay, you get this judge, you get this judge, you get this judge. Just tell the class the story. In some cases, that's really, really quick story. In some cases, like Gideon, it's a longer story, but they're probably more familiar with that story because of the nature of the sword and the Lord and of Gideon, right? You know that story. So read these stories during the week, share them. As a family, you could watch, there's lots of movies on these stories. The 40s or 50s, Samson and Delilah, Angela Lansbury in it. You could go to the library and rent that, or rent it online or something, or check it out and just watch that as a family. Again, it's the 1940s, 50s story of Samson and Delilah. It's kind of a fun one there. And you could, as a family, reenact the story of Gideon and have them reduce the army, talk how they do that, blow the horn, give everyone a paper horn or a horn of some sort, and reenact the story with little kids. That's a fun story to reenact. Primary teachers can do that. I think it's great to discuss, why did Barak not go to war unless Deborah was with him? You could have a conversation of the power of a righteous woman and how she influences not only her man, but an entire family or society. So there's some great things in here that you can do. I hope that gave you a few ideas and will help you with your study and teaching of the book of Judges this week. Have a great summer.